Very briefly, just review what we know about phonics just to make sure we're on the same page. And I'll go through this pretty fast. Uh, we know quite a bit. About every 10 to 15 years in the United States, there seems to be this big study that comes out, or a document, a book that summarizes all we know about early reading. When I travel internationally, they're really intrigued by this. And if you look at this list, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you look at this list, some of these would have played a big role in terms of the training you received based on when you started teaching. So, for example, if you look at that third bullet, the book by Marilyn Adams, Beginning to Read, Thinking and Learning About Print, if you were teaching around 1990, you probably received a lot of training in phonemic awareness, all the different phonological awareness tasks, the connection between phonemic awareness and phonics, and so on. If you were teaching around 2000, when the report of the National Reading Panel came out, you were probably trained on the Big Five. I know many of you can probably recite those from memory: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. Although our focus today really is on phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency, comprehension and vocabulary play a key role in our entire discussion, and we will talk about those as well. But the research hasn't stopped. Even though we have a big body of knowledge, we're still learning more and more. And brain research is one area that is, in some ways, really reinforcing what we're doing, in other ways giving us some new insights. So there was a recent brain research study out of Stanford that got a lot of press when it came out. And if you look at the first bullet, what they did is they were looking at teaching the participants two ways: either sounding out words or learning words by sight. And if you just read the first bullet with me, beginning readers who focus on letter-sound relationships or phonics, instead of trying to learn whole words, increase activity in the area of their brains best wired for reading. I think that's incredibly important for us to understand, because what they're saying is that by teaching children how to blend or sound out words and these letter-sound relationships, it's actually getting the brain ready to become a skilled reader, the part of our brain that we use to be skilled readers. If you drop down to that third bullet, you'll see what happens when the opposite occurs, when we're teaching children early on to learn by sight. Words learned using a whole word method activate the right side of the brain, which is characteristic of children and adults who struggle to read. So this is important for us to understand in terms of our approach when we begin to teach our students how to read. And of course, I know many of you have been hearing about John Hattie's work, visible learning and what have you. He did these meta-analysis where he looked at over 70,000 studies with 300 million students all over the world, trying to figure out what moves the needle in terms of student learning. And so he looked at everything, including phonics. And the second bullet, you see that if whatever he was looking at, a strategy or a technique, if it had an effect size in the research of 0.4 or greater, it equated to about 1 year of growth. And that is what we want, at least a year's growth, whatever we're doing with our students. And with phonics instruction, that last bullet, it had an effect size of 0.6, about 0.6, which is quite significant. So through all of these studies and all of this research that we looked at, we know that it has an impact. We know that it makes a difference. That effect size goes down as children go through the grades, and we know that phonics plays a lesser and lesser role after we have it in place. And that is our goal, is to have it in place really well early on so that we can move on to other aspects of reading. So I always show this slide because this is sort of a really simple summary of the research. Phonics instruction matters, and learning the alphabetic principle is essential to learning to read. I think we all can agree on that. The research is also very clear that phonics instruction is best when it's explicit and systematic. We hear those terms all the time. I wish that we had time to have a more nuanced conversation about it. I wish that people in the field had a more nuanced conversation about it. I'll tell you what these terms mean to me. When it comes to explicit, I'm really thinking about the initial introduction of a letter sound, that we explicitly tell children that the letter S stands for the sound S, instead of using the discovery method early on, because the discovery method requires some prerequisite skills that some of our children don't have, and we don't want to leave any children behind in our instruction. However, having said that, for me, a part of the phonics instructional cycle, what we do throughout a week or 2 weeks, however long the instructional cycle lasts, should also be activities like word building and word sorts, and these activities that get children to play with letters and sounds, and to observe things about words and to talk about what they notice in words. And these kinds of activities, I think, really consolidate and solidify students' understanding of how words work, which is so critical to becoming a successful reader and writer, and gives us some insights into how they're thinking about words, which can really affect what we do in terms of our instruction. And for me, systematic means going from simple to more complex skills in very slow stair step ways. I talk a lot about going from the known to the new in a way that makes the new learning really obvious and really simple for students to grasp. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by that, because I think there are more powerful ways to introduce new skills to get over some of the issues that students have learning these new skills that are these big conceptual leaps. Here again, we're going to talk about that in a second. What the researchers say is that explicit teaching of alphabetic decoding skills is, and read this with me, helpful for all children, harmful for none, and crucial for some. And this is sort of a mantra that I like. Helpful for all, harmful for none, and crucial for some. We know those children for whom this phonics instruction is absolutely crucial. And we know those students who come into school and have intuited or learned a little bit about the system. You know, I had the good fortune of studying with Jean Chaw many years ago. And she used to talk about those students who come to school who are above level, who seem to have intuited part of the system. And she said even a little bit of instruction on how the system works can accelerate their use of that system. I think I was one of those children. My first grade teacher really taught us a little bit about the system early on. It seemed like a puzzle to me. There were these letters, they stood for sounds, we could put them together. And once I got how the system worked, I started noticing sound spellings in words that we hadn't learned those sound spellings, and started using those to read other words. And it just it got the snowball rolling for me. And you have probably all worked with children for whom that is the case as well. I like sharing this slide as well too, because it's really important to me when we talk about phonics that people understand why we're doing phonics. It really is to get an understanding of the text that we're reading. So this phonics comprehension connection is super critical. And when I observe teachers teach, I can really tell if this connection is in the forefront of their thinking, because when it is, the instruction is all about learning those letter sounds and applying it to connect to text reading, to authentic reading and writing opportunities. When I go into a classroom where this connection isn't as obvious to the teacher, isn't in the forefront of his or her thinking, often the phonics instruction is very isolated. It's very sort of removed from text or removed from writing, and we don't get the kind of growth or progress, the speed that we want with that kind of instruction. And so that's a big issue we're going to talk about in a second. But let me go through this flow chart very quickly. We start with phonics instruction. We have these strange squiggles and lines, and they stand for sounds. We teach children those letter-sound relationships so that they can sound out or decode words. And we want children to have lots of opportunities to decode words. We know that for most children, after decoding a word maybe 4 to 12 times in context, they commit those words to memory. So we want lots and lots of decoding practice so that it improves students' word recognition. And the more words that children can automatically recognize, the better their reading fluency. And we know the connection between reading fluency and comprehension at a very basic level. If you think about the kinds of sentences our kindergarten or first graders are reading, they're very short, simple sentences. You think about the sentences our third or fourth graders are reading, they're very complex, long sentences. And the reality is, in terms of our working memory, when we read, we have to get through enough words fast enough in order to make a meaningful chunk. And if we can't do that, then we can't understand what we're reading. And so we need to get the decoding issues, the phonics issues, to fluency very quickly. We need to teach those skills, get them to mastery so that students can then transfer those skills to everything they're reading with ease, which is why we want to do it so well early on, and what is the focus of our discussion today. The last thing I'll say about the research is that phonics is more regular than its reputation. Certainly English isn't the most regular language. Languages like Spanish, which I hear all the time here in New York City, is far more regular. But having said that, about 84% of English words follow these common and consistent sound spelling relationships that we can teach our students, and that we normally teach our students in kindergarten, first and second grade, where one letter reliably stands for a sound. So when you see the letter S, usually, not always, but usually it stands for the sound S. And letter combinations, like when you see the letters SH, you know it's the sound Shh. Exactly. Exactly. So the problem isn't the research evidence. It's been very consistent for decades, but how we have translated that evidence into instructional practice, we've sometimes hit some barriers, some obstacles, and we really need to take a step back and look at, are there barriers and obstacles in what we're doing with our students? And if so, how can we remove them to help our students? So different in these words. Okay, so on the count of three, 1, 2, 3, read. Beat, bit, bait, bet, bat, bite, bot, butt, boat, boot. How are all these words different? Exactly. The medial sound, the vowel sound and spelling. But when you look at these spellings, beat, it's long E. Then you have short I, long A, short E, short A, and so on. These skills and many, many more are covered in grade 1. There's a lot of content. So if you look at a typical scope and sequence, and I know this is very, very tiny, but generally there are 30 weeks of instruction with a different phonics skill each week, and often there's a word study skill. Like in first grade, you might have plurals, you might have contractions, and so on. It's a lot of content. And if we don't have a formal review and repetition cycle, we can't get our students to mastery. So we have what I often see are these exposure focused materials in place. And I believe all teachers want their students to master the content. I don't think that all the materials are helping us do that as effectively as some of our students need to. So if you really want to teach to mastery rather than just exposure, which I think everyone does, it changes the way you teach. It changes the way you do lessons, and it changes the way we assess. When mastery is the goal, you look at things from a different lens, and we need to look at things from that lens because mastery isn't our goal. Our goal is actually transfer. We have to get children to mastery quickly so that then they can use the skill in any reading and writing situation. So we have to do that efficiently. We have to do that quickly because there's a lot of content to get through. So I do some work here in New York City, and I have this mantra that some people sort of chuckle when I say it, but it really holds true for me. No more one and done. No more 1 week and we move on. It's really one and just begun. Every skill in phonics we introduce 1 week, we have to think about how we hold on to that skill for as long as some of our students need in a very purposeful way in order to get them to mastery. And that takes a fair amount of effort. So when I'm working with teachers, I often have them look at the skill they're teaching this particular week and then flip through if they have a formal curriculum, flip through and mark all the places where that skill is formally reviewed or applied. Sometimes we find a little, sometimes we find almost nothing. There is this assumption that once we introduce a skill, then words with that skill will appear in stories, upcoming stories. Sometimes yes. Sometimes the words that appear in upcoming stories are very simple words with that particular skill that perhaps some of our students have already committed to memory. They've learned them earlier or they committed to memory very quickly, so they're not having to access that skill or use it in a way that would get them to the kind of deep learning that we need them to be at. So what do? How do we build in a review and repetition cycle if it doesn't exist? I'm going to show you a couple places in a typical lesson where you could do that quite easily, just as an example to spark your thinking about all the places in the lessons that you are providing in which you could do it. So let's look at when we introduce a skill. We write some words on the board and we teach children how to blend or sound them out. There are two ways in which we can blend words. The top way, the continuous blending, is the most common, where you write a word on the board, you run your finger into the letters, and you slowly string together the sounds. So do that with me. If I were to run my finger under the top word you see, it would be sat. A little faster, sat. What's the word? Sat. Right. And that's a very efficient way to model blending, to model how to sound out a word. However, when I first introduced the concept to young learners about how to use their phonics to sound out words, I use what's called final blending, where I go letter by letter, sound by sound. And I do that for two reasons. Number one, I want to make sure they know the letter sounds really well that we're working with. And number two, I want to make sure that they have the prerequisite phonemic awareness skills. If children can't orally string together or blend sounds, like if I say s, at, and after hearing those, they can't blend those together to say the word sat, then they're not going to be able to read the word if I write SAT on the board. So the way this kind of blending looks is often I use letter cards and I'm sliding the letter cards in, but I point to the first letter and I say sound. They say, point to the next letter, sound. They say ah. Put it together, they go sa, and so on. And we work through the word that way. I only do this for a couple of weeks where I'm checking if my students have those prerequisite skills and they're ready to move at a much faster pace. But I keep final blending in my back pocket because when I'm working with students in small group who might be struggling, it's great to drop down to final blending to check to see, are there some specific sound spellings that are really tripping them up? Or are there some students who still have some really serious phonemic awareness issues that I need to do some additional work on? So it's great to have both of those in your repertoire of strategies. Okay, so when I first started watching teachers teach phonics and they would introduce the words, often they would do what you see here. They would write a few words on the board, introduce the new skill. If you look at these words, you know that we're working on short O. And they would teach children how to sound out a couple of them. Maybe they would have a couple that the children would practice together. And when I saw this, I thought, okay, there's some issues that we have with this. Number one, there's no review and repetition cycle. I don't know what short vowels were taught before this because there are no words with any other vowel except the one that we're focusing on. So that's a missed opportunity. Everything that we do with our students, we can keep folding in those skills in very purposeful ways. The other thing is I would often see this done whole class. And we know if we're doing anything whole class, some students are right there. There's some students who already know this. And we don't want to waste their time. And there's some students who aren't there yet. And anything we do whole class, we have to differentiate. We have to have some entry points where the children who might be a little bit behind get something out of the lesson. We need some challenge points for the children who already know this, get something out of the lesson. We can't waste a single child's time. So a very basic example of that, if we're doing a phonemic awareness task and I'm having children orally blend words sound by sound, I will start the activity one step earlier, having them blend onset rhyme, like at. I put that together before I go at. I'm always thinking about going from easier to more complex and differentiating whole group. It's really important that every child gets something out of every phonics lesson if we're doing anything whole group. So that is one issue, the lack of differentiation. The other thing is if you look at these words, they're random. There's no sort of logic to them. And when I'm teaching, and you know this, the best teaching is when you're teaching and assessing simultaneously. As you teach, you are collecting information based on the responses your students are giving, and you are adjusting on the fly. It's very hard to do that when your exercises are random, but if I organize them from easier to more complex, like I want to show you on the next slide, and the children are chorally reading these words, I can hear and I can see when children are struggling, when they start to fall down. And that gives me some really great formative assessment information that I can act on during the lesson and right after the lesson. And the other thing that I want to break the habit of is I often encounter students who, when they're reading, they might look at the first part of a word or the first and last part and maybe the picture and then sort of guess at the word. I want to break them of that habit. I want them to know very early on every letter, every sound counts. So I want to have words that are very similar that forces them to fully analyze words. So those are a lot of big goals, right? So this is what my revised blending lines would look like. So if you look at, and just look at the words in black, what I've done is I've taken some short O words and I've organized them from easier to more complex. I will model the first couple words. So I will model how to sound out the words not and hot, and have children repeat. And then I will have children chorally read the rest of the words. I tap on the word, I pause for a second for them to whisper blend it, or if they want to blend in their head, and then I tap on it and we do it together. So it's slower the first time we go through this list. It gets faster as we go throughout the week. So if you look at the words in the first row and read them with me, not, hot, lot, dot, you will see that they vary by the initial letter and sound. Pretty easy. And my students who might be a little bit behind, after I modeled not and hot and talked about how they both end in not, they have an opportunity to be successful with lot and dot. So then I get to the next list, read line 2 with me. 1, 2, 3, read, lot, log, dot, dog. You'll see now I'm varying the final sound, a little more difficult. If you look at the third list and read those with me, 1, 2, 3, read hot, hat, hit, hut. Now I'm varying the medial sound, much more difficult. So you see each line gets progressively more complex, and the last line they vary in all the possible ways. So as I'm going through this, I'm saying, oh, I still have some children who aren't fully asleep. Oh, I still have some children who are struggling with short vowels. I need to do more work on that. So that gives me some initial information, formative assessment information to work on. If you look at the words in red, where do you think these words come from? That's right, the previous 4 to 6 weeks of instruction. So that first line, cat, red, bit, leg, for this particular class, I chose words with short vowels we had been working on that they had seen in stories and what have you. So these are words I expected them to be able to read. The next line, rip, map, fun, bug, there's some words in that line that they haven't seen. So now I'm looking at, can they start applying those skills to new words? Are they beginning the process of transfer? So even in those review lines, the first line is easier than the second. And then the last line, jog to jogging, hop to hopping. Those are words for my students who are above level. So I've chosen a skill that's further in the scope and sequence. I could have chosen short O words that begin with blends or that begin with digress, anything further in the scope and sequence that I can then reinforce with those students when I'm reading with them in small group. So we go through this very quickly. It goes from easy to more complex. I'm collecting some great formative assessment information. I built in my review and repetition cycle, and I've differentiated it so that all children are getting something from the lesson. That's the kind of thing that we can do to build in a review and repetition cycle and get more bang for our buck in terms of what we're doing in blending. It looks like a lot of words. This activity should take at most 5 minutes. It's a little slower at the beginning. The first day you do it, but as you repeat this throughout the week, it gets much, much faster. And then these blending lines I give to students, they read with partners during independent work time. They can take them home to read with their parents and so on. There are a lot of things that we can do with those. And for children who are struggling, I'll take this list to small group and we will work through the words much more slowly. Maybe we don't get through all of them, but we get through more at a pace that's appropriate for where those students are. So this idea of minimal contrast is a really big deal for me in terms of phonics instruction. You saw that example with hat, hit, hot, hut. But it goes back to my notion of having instruction in phonics that is systematic, that goes from the known to the new in very simple steps. And I'm going to show you one example of why this is so critical and what I notice a lot when I'm watching phonics lessons. Often in a scope and sequence, after children learn CVC words, if you think about kindergarten, the most state standards have children master CVC words by the end of kindergarten. So children for months and months and months, they're doing one letter, one sound, one letter, one sound, hat, run, sit, etc. The next skill on the scope and sequence in many scope and sequences is what is sometimes referred to as final E, silent E. Some people call it magic E, boss E. There are all kinds of titles for it. But words like, take, save. If you think about that conceptually, if you're a young learner and for months you've been doing one letter, one sound, and all of a sudden you're introduced with words where 2 letters in the word are working as a team, and they're not even beside each other in the word. It's a huge conceptual leap. So how do we introduce children to that leap? So what I do is I use minimal contrast. I go from the known to the new, and we have a rich conversation about those words. So I go from hat to hate. I'll write those words on top of each other. I go from hop to hope. Ask children what they notice. We read those 2 words. We talk about what is different. We talk about how the O and the E work together. The vowel can say its name and so on. A lot of what should be happening during phonics lessons are these really rich conversations about how words work. We need to set up opportunities for children to verbalize their thinking and verbalize what they notice so that they can really internalize these concepts. So if we're doing vowel digraphs, vowel teams, going from set to seat, then I can have a really great conversation about the power of that EA team, or map to meet, which is a little more difficult. Here again, we can have a conversation about the power of that team. Toward the end of first grade, beginning of second grade, when we're starting to transition to multisyllabic words, taking very basic words that children know like can and rat, and attaching a syllable like the consonant plus LE syllables you see here, going from can to candle, and rat to rattle. All of a sudden, that new syllable type pops out. It's so obvious for young learners. I can have a conversation about if a word ends in LE, the consonant before it in LE, form that last chunk. So you're going to say that chunk together. And they already know part of the word, so it's much, much easier to attack big words in that way. As we move up through the grades, showing these related words like happy to happily that you see on that bottom list. A lot of children will see happily and have no idea it comes from the word happily because of the spelling change. But when I show it this way, we have that conversation about why did the Y change and what other words do we know where the Y changed. These really rich, deep conversations and interesting conversations, hopefully, about how words work. So the other thing that I do periodically throughout my instruction is I will present students with minimal contrast sentences. I want to check periodically, are they able to apply this to connected text? So if you look at sentence number 1 and read that with me, I hate that hat. If a child can read that sentence as quickly as you and I just read it, they are really good at noticing very subtle differences in words that are quite similar. And that is our goal. So these minimal contrast sentences are really great at testing that and seeing who's there and who isn't. So I like including these in my instruction as well. So maybe I have those blending lines that you saw, and then I'll add a few of these minimal contrast sentences to see where my students